when Renee was emailing me, she asked me before I started speaking about Walter's survival to talk a little bit about the mandate AB 816 for Holocaust education that is sitting right now in Madison. Is that where you'd like me to start?
That'd be great. And we were going to be talking about that when we got back after spring break. So you will need to introduce them to that because they don't have any idea probably what you're talking about.
Okay. There's 13 states in the United States that have passed a mandate, a law. Mandate means law, even though I don't really like the word mandate, but that's the way it is, to teach Holocaust education in the Wisconsin schools. Unfortunately, MPS, that's Milwaukee Public Schools, and others have taken certain parts of history and did not feel it was as important to teach. However, this is one segment of history, not because I'm Jewish, because there were 6 million Jewish people that were put to death and 5.5 million Christians for one way or another, that it had to continue being taught. We saw upsurgence of hate, bullying, and many other factors, and that's the way this all started before the mass genocide. So, being as though there were 13 states that already proved this law mandate, we had to start really doing some investigation. So we formed a task force, and who joined our task force was the Catholic Archdiocese. There are 13 schools within the Catholic Archdiocese in the Milwaukee area that we speak to, and there will be more and more as time goes by. And here's what basically the mission is of the mandate. It's to build a better world, resting on the values of tolerance and diversity, dignity and respect to all human beings by teaching the lessons of the Holocaust. So we have a senator here in Milwaukee, Alberta Darling, who decided that she was going to be the one that was going to present this to the assembly in Madison. And we put together a group of teachers, survivors, students. We had students from Kenosha, Racine, Salem, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Christian schools, public schools, and the average student was in 8th grade, 8th and 9th grade, and they have heard lectures on the Holocaust before. And they were absolutely eloquent, especially the representative from the Prairie School in Racine. It's been a long time since I've heard anyone quite as elegant as her. So we went before the assembly and it was passed 98-0. From there, the mandate had to go before the Senate Educational Committee. It's all the steps in politics that you take to get any type of law passed. And it passed the Senate Educational Committee. Unfortunately, as it was going before, the law was going before the Senate at large, COVID-19 came to be. And everything changed because the Senate had priorities in order to keep the residents of Wisconsin safe. So we fell to the bottom of the list, and we probably will not hear whether this is being brought forth to the Senate until sometime, we hope, after summer. And then if it passes, the governor signs, and it becomes a mandate to teach this subject in the schools. It's very interesting because I've never been involved with politics. I know about them, but I choose to stay in my world of education and my volunteer work at a nursing home in Milwaukee, and I feel that I'm much healthier. In my volunteer work at the nursing home, the one thing that I don't allow my volunteers to do, and I guess that sounds terrible that I say don't allow, is to discuss politics. We all have a right. My husband used to say that the greatest gift he was ever given in his lifetime was when his papers came through to come to the United States. And that was the weekend of Memorial Day of 1948, that his ship, the General Stewart, with his late wife and his son Andre, entered the harbor of New York, only to be told that the federal offices were closed and that they had to dock near the Statue of Liberty, which always sort of remained in his mind. When people over the years used to challenge him as to what his politics were, he said, I lived all my life just about in a country that suppressed my ability to speak, my ability to make selection. He said, and now I'm in a country, he said, that I have my freedoms and I respect whatever anybody else feels regarding who they want to vote for. And I come from a family that said you vote for the person, not for the party. I've always believed that if students have a question, that they are certainly free to stop me from speaking and ask me the question, because it's very hard to wait sometimes to the end of a person speaking to remember what you want to say, unless you can jot it down. But I have to ask the students and teachers that I'm reaching an age where sometimes I forget where I left off. So if you're going to stop me and ask me a question, I would appreciate if you help me remember where I left off. Walter. Were any videos shown of Walter prior to my speaking?
I offered them out the video of Walter speaking, I think it was from 1995. I can't guarantee they all watched it because they had a choice of 10 different resources to look at and read.
Okay.
So hopefully they at least saw what he looked like. I can't guarantee they listened. I think the video was 90 minutes long. I can't guarantee they listened to it, but I know quite a few, because they reflected upon the Holocaust last week. That was their assignment. Quite a few people did talk about Walter. So I know they at least looked at it.
So in the future, the website from HERC, the Holocaust Education Resource Center, has been updated so that there are many survivors, including Walter, that have given testimony, and you won't have to listen for 90 minutes. But I credit you with the fact that at least the students, those who did hear, know who I'm talking about.
And Arleen, I'm making a note to send out the Holocaust Resource Center information for them so they can at least see him in person video too.
Okay, Nathan and Esther Peltz, P-E-L-Z, Holocaust Education Resource Center, and it's become a little bit easier and more sophisticated to get to what, or any of the past programming you can get to too. I met Walter in 1972. Walter was the first Holocaust survivor that I ever met. I knew about the Holocaust, but I didn't know a lot about it. When I went to high school, and don't ask me how many years ago, they really didn't talk too much. They talked about Pearl Harbor, they talked about World War II, the battles, but they didn't talk about the death camps. And they didn't talk about the concentration camps. And you're probably looking at me and wondering why I'm separating death camps and concentration camps. The death camps were like Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, Dachau. Their purpose was elimination of people. The concentration camps, where people also died, whether it be from starvation or beatings or being shot, they did not have gas chambers and they did not have crematoriums. But they had labor forces. They had underground factories for many reasons. Ammunition factories, uniform factories. I could go on, and it was all done by what they call slave labor. And the people who worked in these factories, they rotated every couple months. So in case somebody escaped, which was very hard to do, that there wouldn't be a lot of information that could be given to the outside world. But in the death camps, of which unfortunately Walter was in 5, from 1939 to 1945, their one purpose for their labor forces was death. And in Walter's case, the first camp where he was a prisoner for 18 months was Majdanek. I've been there twice. I cannot believe that one human being can do what they did to others. His job at Majdanek was to take the bodies out of the gas chambers and bring them to the crematoriums to be burned. He said that death was around him every day. He said you almost became oblivious to it. He said the starvation, the beatings, the whippings, the Nazis were famous for their whips, he says was almost unbearable. I usually don't read from anything at all, but I have to read to you something that a student wrote to me a while back when he summarized, and it was an 8th grade student, Walter's story. I'll read you just 2 lines. Throughout Walter's life, the screams of agony echoed in his ears, and horrific visions of his past raced through his mind. Walter Peltz was never able to forget his experiences during the terrible atrocity known as the Holocaust. When Walter came to this country, he was married. Rose and Walter lived in Germany for a while after they were liberated. She was from Hungary, Budapest, with the hopes of finding family that had survived the Holocaust. Unfortunately, after a short while in the United States, I did not know her, members of my family did. Rose became terminally ill. She had cancer, and within 7 years, at 40-some years old, she passed away. Now, when I met Walter and he told me he was a widower, he had been alone for 4 years, and I had been divorced for quite a while. And I heard some about his background. All I could think to myself is, after going through what they went through in Europe, after the losses they endured, how in the world could she be struck down by a terminal illness, leaving 2 small children, as she did, Susie, who has become my best friend, and Andre, after all she went through? I was introduced to Walter in 1972 by a friend of my father's. I knew he had a cute accent. I didn't know exactly what country he was from. I'm not exactly a quiet person, but I'm not a nosy person either. So, of course, I didn't ask him a lot of questions, but he asked me a lot of questions. Were you from originally Milwaukee? Were your grandparents from Milwaukee? He says, Milwaukee? Grandparents from Milwaukee? That's almost unheard of. Yes, I'm 3rd generation American. Oh, and what about your family, Walter? I don't have any. What do you mean you don't have any? He said, my entire family in Poland, in Germany, and the small family I had in Paris in France were all murdered or died of starvation. He said, my 3 sisters, my brother, my mother and father, his father was 39 years old when he was walking down the street wearing the yellow Star of David, stopped by 2 SS officers One pulled out his pistol, God only knows for what reason, and shot Walter's father there. His mother was 37 years old. She died of starvation. He had a sister, 9, 12, and 14, Bella, Magdalena, and Faye, and a brother, Morris, who was 15. Walter was the oldest. After all these years of speaking, I have to take a breath after I say this because it's just inconceivable to me. I'm sorry. How in the world did you find the strength to go on with your life after staying on in Europe, hopefully registering with the Red Cross and other immigrant organizations to help people find their families? How in the world did you find the strength to go on with your life? And he looked at me with his sweet, handsome face, and he said to me, Arleen, there's two choices in life. One, in Auschwitz for 2 years, I couldn't take it anymore. He said, and I wanted to take my life. He was embarrassed to tell me this because, you know, he knew about depression, he knew about other things, but he was not, if you would have known how strong he was in character, you would know that suicide was something that you would have never thought a man like him would have done. He said, I knew after I met Rose and we married that I would never again try to take my life. And in the camps, it was very easy. All of the camps were surrounded by barbed wire, and the upper part of the barbed wire was electrified. And day after day, he saw from the women's camp and the men's camp, because the women and men were divided, people walking up that just couldn't go on with their life anymore to the barbed wire, putting their hands up against the electrical part, and that was it. So he said, Arleen, you find the strength somehow, whether it's through religion or through other people or just wanting to live life, to find the strength to go on with your life. And that's what he did. Rose and him were married shortly after they were liberated by the American Army on the death march out of Dachau. And they stayed on in Germany for 3 years with her hopes of finding her family. She did find her sister, Thule, who is no longer alive. And of course, for Walter, the search never stopped. No matter where we traveled, no matter if it was in the United States or it was in Europe, our daughter lived in Israel for 15 years, he would take the phone book, and he spoke many languages, so it was very easy for him to go into a foreign country and read their phone books. And he looked for two names, Peltz, and there's 3 different spellings. The German is P-E-L-C, and we have people in Milwaukee with that spelling. They're not our family, but they're dear friends. Our spelling, P-E-L-T-Z, and then P-E-L-Z, which is the way Nathan Esther Peltz, who the Holocaust Center is named after, spelled their name. I never understood why they just didn't have one spelling, but it all depended upon who the immigration officer was. When they came to this country, they could hardly speak English, and when they pronounced their names, the officer spelled it as he thought it should be spelled. Walter was 18 months in Majdanek, then sent to Auschwitz. At Auschwitz, the famous railroad tracks that you see in many of the documentaries, Walter and a dear friend of his in Kansas who lives in Kansas City and others became the but I walked into one of the barracks that's now a museum. And after seeing the glassed-in walls of human hair, one wall, children's shoes, adult shoes, from ceiling to floor, the next wall was crutches and canes and old-fashioned wheelchairs. And I looked at, and my mother and stepfather were with us on this first trip, and I looked at my mom and Walter, and I just said, I have to go outside. I really felt that I would not be able to stay in that barrack without passing out, and I had to get some fresh air. The second time I went back, years later, and that by that time, I had heard Walter speak many times, and I had a different outlook as to what I had to learn being an American-born citizen whose family was not touched at all by this period of time in history. You're probably wondering why we went back so often. Walter had several Christian families that upon one point in time before he was captured helped him. He lived on their farm. He helped raise their horses. They lived in a rural area. The name was Szyberski. They changed his name from Wladek, which is Walter in Polish, to Michaelis, because when he went to church with them on Sunday, which he loved going to church with them on Sunday, and he was introduced, they wanted a name that was more common in their area. For helping my husband, these wonderful people who I met, the children, not the adults, they were deceased by the time I got there. I stayed in the farmhouse where he was hidden. They took, when they came for Walter, they took 26 innocent farmers, their wives, the husbands, the children from the surrounding area, stood them, killed them one by one as punishment to the Szyberski family and the Royak family for helping one Jew. These people that were murdered were people that Marisha Szyberski, the youngest daughter, and her brothers, Janek, Johnny, and her other brothers, Thaddeus, Ted, they grew up together in this area. They went to school together. They went to church together. They married into each other's families. And because they were humanitarians and they decided that my husband had the right to live, 26 of their friends and their children were murdered. My husband said after we were married, when I asked him about dreams, he said, Arleen, to tell you the truth, I don't know what a dream is. He said, I only know from nightmares. And he didn't dwell on the Holocaust. He had health problems. He had business failures. He never used it as a crutch. And I have to tell all of you who don't know me, I think Renee knows me better than everybody, is that I am not trying to make him be a person that is on a pedestal. He had faults just like me, but he was of a very strong personality, strong physical being, which I greatly admired. But there aren't any pedestals for either one of us because we were far, and I am far, I can tell you, from perfect. I know what the word mischief is all about. Walter came from a very poor family. They lived in one room in a very, very large apartment building in the capital of Poland, Warsaw. They had one bed for his three sisters, and he and his brother Morris slept on the floor. Their carpeting was hay. His father tried to make a living as a wood carver. His grandfather had been a wood carver of custom-made furniture, and he taught Walter's father the trade. But after World War I, the economy of Poland never recovered, and there was no demand for handmade furniture. So the best that he could do was make wooden toys and try to sell them in sort of an open-air market area. Walter was 10 years old. He was in the 3rd grade. He loved school. And his father told him that he had to quit school and help him to support the family. Now, all of you who are on this particular Zoom know that at 10 years old, you would be very, very limited. Very, very limited as to what jobs you could have. You're not old enough to babysit, but you can cut a lawn, you can shovel snow. In Walter's case, he was offered to apprentice to 2 trades. Nowadays, you can apprentice as an electrician, a plumber, but in those years in Europe, especially Poland, there were 2 trades that were popular: shoemaker and tailor, of which he said to his father, I can't even imagine him talking to his father this way. He said, I hate both. I hate both. I want to stay in school. I want to make something of myself. I want to become an architect or engineer. And then I can help the family. Well, from 10 years old to 20-some years old. And of course, at that time, he did not know that a Jew couldn't go on to high school until he passed certain tests, because it was starting to be where businesses were starting to be banned because they were owned by Jewish people. They were being put into a ghetto. They had to leave their homes and everything behind, and then started education. Doctors couldn't be doctors anymore because of their religion. Lawyers couldn't be lawyers anymore. So he decided to, what he said, the lesser of his evils, to apprentice as a tailor. Now, as I got to know him over the years, and I asked him several times, how in the world did you survive these camps? He said, I volunteered for everything. He said, I volunteered for everything they wanted. If they needed a barber, I volunteered as a barber. If they needed somebody to tattoo, which you know in Auschwitz, they tattoo the bodies of their labor forces. He said, I helped tattoo. I said, but did you ever stop to think, as a tailor, you were greatly needed for mending uniforms, for when people got promoted, sewing on their stripes? He said, well, that might be your way of thinking, but he said, that wasn't my way. My thought was, he said, I had a dream, and I had 2 wishes. One was for an extra piece of bread because I was so hungry. The other was a dream that America and Canada and Great Britain, and I can go on and name the countries, would enter the war. And maybe one day again, we would be free and be able to start a life. That was our dream, to once again be free. He worked until he was 18 years old. The apprenticeship was over. He worked as a tailor. He made a little money. He gave it to his mother with the hopes of her going to the butcher and buying an extra chicken or a piece of meat. He was more concerned about his little sisters than he was anything else. He fixed bicycles in the neighborhood. When I married him, I said, well, how do you know how to do all this stuff? Well, some people don't have to read handbooks. I read a handbook and I still don't know what to do, but that's not the point. And then 1939. From 1933, some say 1932, so I won't argue the point, until 1939, a madman named Adolf Hitler, who was, as a speaker, charismatic, So he won people to his side, built a war machine. What I mean by war machine, an army, a navy, an air force, greater than the world had ever seen, with powerful equipment, new type of tanks and rifles and machine guns. And here was the capital of Warsaw to defend their city that had the old rifles from World War I and still were using cannons against tanks. So in 1939, when Hitler's demand was the first country to take over was Czechoslovakia, and once Czechoslovakia was taken over by the Nazis, his hate for Poland was horrible. He used the citizens of Poland to help him build Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, and I could go on and on, the death camps. But afterwards, he wanted them dead. They marched into Warsaw, September 1st, 1939, my birthday. And it was a short period of time with the bombing of the city and their lack of help from any other country that Walter's unit of men, he was drafted into the Polish army at 18, his 400 to 500 men in his unit, there was 14 left. And the officer, a very kind man, he said to his men, they were all different religions, he said, we're going to die, and I don't want to die here. He said, there's a village not too far from here. We have to cross the Vistula, which is a large river that goes through Warsaw. It's sort of like the Mississippi and into other areas of Poland. He said, once we get safely across that bridge, he said, there's a small village where there's a train that stops twice a day and goes into Russia. In those years, Russia had an open door. There were two places that somebody could go without papers, no matter what religion you were. And especially the Jews had no place to go, was Russia and Shanghai, which later on became the Shanghai Ghetto. Somehow, all the men followed their officer. They made it across the bridge. God only knows where the sentries were. I said to Walter, I mean, he didn't remember everything. He said, Arleen, they drank a lot, so they probably were someplace off someplace, not following what they were supposed to follow. And they made it to this village and hid in the woods until they heard the sound of the train. And the officer instructed his men how, when the train started picking up momentum, that they would all help each other to get onto a train. And there isn't one person I'm speaking to right now in Mayville that doesn't know how difficult it would be to jump onto a moving train. All of them got on. They thought they were safe. Their plan was to go into Russia to work at the famous mountains Ural coal mines, if they could, to make some money and go back to where they're from and help their families. Well, they got to the border and the train was stopped. And there was no knowledge whether it was the Gestapo, the private police of Hitler, or the SS that had come onto the train to check papers. And the officer said to the men who weren't Jewish, they said, you have papers, but you're in a Polish uniform, which means they know that you ran away from your unit. And at that time, there was no pact made about prisoners of war. This was right at the beginning. So that would have meant, as he said, you'll be shot on sight. The only chance we have is if they don't make it back here, is as the train starts moving, that as it rounds a bend, that we all jump. 14 men jumped, 3 got up. The officer, my husband, and a gentleman who I met many years later who lived in Flint, Michigan, who also was hidden by families in Poland later on. He said Walter said the cries from those who were still alive with broken backs, broken necks, yelling to us, please take us with you. We want to live too. We had no way to carry them. We did not know where we were as far as Russian border was concerned. He said, the vision of those men and their cries lived with me all my life. He stayed in Russia for a few weeks. He worked and couldn't live with himself that he didn't know what happened to his family. So he wrote a note thanking the officer because he knew if he talked to him, the officer would talk him out of leaving. And he made his way by foot, hiding during the day, walking at night, bitten by dogs. One farmer, unfortunately, he had stab wounds, Walter, scars on his body, drinking putrid water, eating grass. And there, after 10 days, he comes to his beloved city where he was born and raised. And from the constant bombing, there was only a few buildings left. He didn't even know where to find the street to Jelna, which once had the apartment building where he lived in the one room. But an elderly man saw him who recognized Walter. He must have lived in the building. And he came to Walter and spoke to him in Polish and said, are you looking for your family? And this is a gentleman who told Walter that his father, Aaron, at 39 years old, is dead. He said, your brother, Morris, and your oldest sister, Bella, are fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto with a group of young people to try to save the ghetto and not be liquidated. They were murdered going out of the ghetto, trying to buy ammunition from the partisans, the civilian military that were fighting to save their country, and they were mostly found in the forest and wooded areas. On one of those times, they both were murdered, by whom no one will ever know. His middle sister, Magdalena, was taken to Treblinka and immediately was killed. The gentleman who was so kind to Walter, the elderly gentleman, said, if you're looking for your mother, I can take you to a drainage ditch. Not like we know drainage ditches. I'm talking about a muddy hole in the ground. He said, your mother and your youngest sister are hiding there, and I can take you just to the opening, and then you're on your own. As he climbed down into that ditch, that hole in the ground, he saw a candle burning against the far wall and a swollen figure of a human being, his mother, 37 years old, Sarah, lying on the ground. She was almost gone from starvation. He didn't know where his little sister was at that time. And when his mother opened her eyes and saw him, when Walter told me this story, he looked at me and he said, Arleen, it's so hard for me to tell you this. So I said, stop. He said, no, you have to know this. He said, my mother looked at me and said to me, I couldn't believe what she said to me. Why did you come back? And he looked at her, he said, Arleen, I had tears in my eyes. And I said, Mother, you don't even know where I was. I came back to save my family. She said, son, you are my strongest and you are my oldest. If any one of us is going to live to tell the story of what has happened to all of us, it's going to be you. Before the Gestapo finds out, it only took, one person to see him, to report. for their 5 pounds of sugar that they got as a reward for reporting a Jew. That was only in Poland, so don't think it was in other countries. She said, I want you to leave. I want you to find a way to leave and hide. And by the time she was telling him this, his little sister crawled down into that hole, and she was carrying in her hands rotten potato peels that she must have found in the garbage, and begging, kneeling in front of her mother, not even realizing the brother is there, kneeling in front of the mother, begging that she should try to get up and maybe make them a little soup. The greatest guilt that he had is that he could not take his sister with him. He didn't know where he was going. It was a tearful goodbye, and as it became night, he made his way through the large Jewish cemetery, which borders with the farmland. And the terrain of Poland is very much like Wisconsin, beautiful, beautiful farm country. He knocked on farm door after farm door. All he wanted was a place to stay for the night and something to drink. And they had families. He said, I never judged them for not helping me. He said they were afraid for their families. But the last door, the very last door, he said, the farmer came to him and said, you can sleep in my barn tonight, and I will bring you something to drink and some food. And I'm going to tell you about a large farm. It was a manor, more of a, I don't like to use the word plantation, but it was a very large manor. The people that lived there are humanitarians. It happened to be the Szyberskis he was talking about. If you have a chance for people to help you, it will be there. But if I find you in my barn in the morning, I will have to kill you. He left, Walter left early in the morning. He must have looked, can you imagine somebody who hadn't bathed for weeks? He had been bitten by dogs, torn, whatever he was wearing, God only knows, was all ripped, filthy, dirty, and yet he knocked on the door at the Szyberskis. They didn't ask him if he was a Jew or a Catholic or a Lutheran. They knew that he was running from something. And for 6 months, he helped them raise their horses, plant. I met the children when they weren't children anymore. I can just imagine how gentle the parents were from whom I met of this very large family. I thank them. And we took each one of our children back years later to thank them for what they did and how they suffered because of helping one man who happened to be Jewish. After 6 months, one of the neighbors was very fearful what was going to happen if they found out that Walter was in the area. So they reported to the Gestapo that the Szyberskis were helping Walter. And that's how, I'm sort of shortening it because of time, 26 wonderful neighbors, Christians, were murdered because of the Szyberskis and one other family, the Royaks, helping one human being. He was taken by the SS to Majdanek, 18 months, Auschwitz, 2 years, Birkenau, a subsidiary camp of Auschwitz, then to Oranienburg in Germany, then to Sachsenhausen, and finally to Dachau. And I have to apologize to everyone who is watching me right now, because I'm going to say to you that Walter said when he thought he had been to hell and back, he found out what hell was in Dachau. There were not enough barracks to house the people. They dug ditches in the mud. They had cardboard for their roof. It didn't make any difference if it was winter, summer, whatever. That's the way they had to live. He said the beatings were daily. He said the gas chambers couldn't pump out enough dead bodies enough, and the crematoriums could not burn the bodies enough. When I went back in 75, the first time, I can tell you when I walked into a crematorium, that was my first experience there, is that you could actually see human bones that they didn't have time to burn. Then a famous Nazi by the name of Adolf Eichmann came up with a new idea because they knew they were losing the war. The Russians were coming in from one side, the Americans from another, the British, the Canadians. And he decided that they should mine the Austrian Alps and get rid of anybody who could identify what they did to these people. They marched these poor people day and night, no water, no food, from all these camps in Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, supposedly to this one area that was mined. How stupid they were, because what they left behind that they didn't have time to burn or bury was evidence enough. And there were still people in the infirmaries that were half dead that could attest to what happened there. Walter was lucky enough to be liberated by the American Army in the middle of a field. That's where he met Rose on that death march. I said to him, after 5.5 years a prisoner, I said, you still could be attracted to a good-looking woman, because what photos I saw, she was a very good-looking woman. He said, Arleen, desperation does horrible things. I'm not telling you my marriage was out of desperation. I'm telling you loneliness and being alone and having no one and being liberated and don't know where you're going to go and what you're going to do and how you're going to survive. He said, you attach yourself to people. And I later learned that here in Milwaukee. I was lucky enough to give Walter a mother-in-law, a father-in-law, a brother-in-law, aunts, uncles, cousins, and he was so good to them. My greatest wish that I could have returned to his family what respect he gave to mine. But he had a whole world of surrogate family here in Milwaukee and elsewhere. The friends attached themselves to each other. They became each other's family. And there was an American family here in Milwaukee that Walter met by going into a little grocery store that they owned on the north end of Milwaukee. And their name was Hurwitz, that spiritually adopted Walter, Rose, and the children. Susie was born here. And they had at least somebody they could call grandma and grandpa. If not what flowed in their blood, it was what was in their heart with these people. Walter and Rose stayed in Germany for one reason, to find family, as I told you in the beginning. And then they decided it was time to leave. And they applied for Milwaukee, Wisconsin, ironically, because they had befriended somebody after the war who had an uncle in Milwaukee who had a little furniture store. And Heinz and his wife had immigrated a year before Walter to the States. And since you don't know anybody at all, at least you pick a city. And it was well known as an industrial city. So the thought of getting a job was most important. And their papers came through. And they came. And they landed in this, the ship docked in New York, and they were put on a train for Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the Peltzes that were already here, Nathan, Esther, others, were told by one of the Jewish family services that another Peltz is coming from Poland. That's all they had to hear. They didn't know if it was a cousin or who it was, but everybody was at the railroad station, Walter said, with a social worker from one of the agencies who, believe it or not, years later ended up marrying a cousin of mine many years later. And Walter and her had a reunion. My cousin wasn't Jewish, had a reunion at a Christmas dinner at my cousin's house. He was here 3 days. He got a job as a tailor in an area called West Dallas. The gentleman who owned the shop, Mr. Friedman, happened to be a German Jew. Walter could speak German and Polish and Russian and many other languages. And he worked for him for a couple years, saved a little money, and then bought a small tailor shop that was for sale on 6th and Wisconsin Avenue downtown. It was called Walter's Tailor Shop. After a couple years, he threw that thimble across the room, went to UWM, took an equivalency test. He never stopped learning. He slept with a dictionary. Every time there was a word he didn't know, he used the dictionary, not like me that I just scan it and guess it. And he took an equivalency test and passed third grade educated person. He passed with very high marks and had the nerve to apply for a job at Mutual of Omaha, a very large insurance company. They gave him tests. He passed. They sent him to school in Omaha, Nebraska. While others that he got to know there were out having their drinks and dinner, he sat in the hotel room with a tape recorder, reading the manuals, talking into the tape recorder, playing it back, and they gave him an oral test, and he became an insurance agent for Mutual of Omaha for quite a few years, and then a district director in Milwaukee. It's probably hard for a lot of you to hear this and believe it. I found, as I heard the stories of so many families, we had 80-some families here in Milwaukee at one time, of survivors of all religions. It was like hearing once upon a time. I'm ashamed to tell you this because I couldn't comprehend, after what people went through, that they had the courage to go on with their lives. And I learned that I better stop asking how they survived because not everybody could talk about it. For some people, it was like opening up a wound that would never heal anyway. So I was very, very careful when I talked to the survivors, but I made myself a solemn promise. First of all, I must tell you that I was never so proud and thankful to be an American-born person after I met survivors. I took for granted what I called the easy life. My parents were very hard workers. I mean, there was no silver spoon in my family, but it still was a nice life. Grandma lived with us. There was enough food. We went to circus. We went to state fair. We did all those wonderful things. And we never saw death or people being annihilated. We knew about shootings. Well, that's been every century we have shootings. And Walter was a very, very sick man when he came here, and Rose was not that well either, and many, many surgeries were done at the Mayo Clinic. When I came into the picture in 1972, he still was not that well, but, you know, he went on. But he never used that period of time as an excuse as to the failures he had. He had a grocery store, it didn't work out. He had a dry cleaning store, it didn't work out. But Mutual of Omaha worked out. And then Rose passed away. And Walter had to support 2 children, and he couldn't travel anymore to the rural areas of Wisconsin, where his Polish and German were very helpful as far as speaking to people, because there was Stevens Point. People learned Polish before they learned English in those years. So it was very easy for him using his languages, but he couldn't keep traveling. He had family. So a friend of his told him about another gentleman who had a truck. And he used to peddle rags and paper and metals and go up and down alleys into small businesses. And he needed help. So Walter sold insurance locally, and he went on this truck for quite a while. He was a peddler. And finally, after doing this for a while, the gentleman he was with, his name was Pete, he said to him, if we're going to stay together, we're going to have to try to find a small piece of land and open up a junk shop. And they had nothing. They had no money. I don't even know if the truck was paid for. And Walter had made some wonderful American friends. He had joined a veterans group. And one of his friends, the brother, happened to be an officer at one of the banks in Milwaukee. And he had enough faith in Walter and his partner. They got a loan. They bought a small junk shop in West Dallas that had been stagnant for a long time. And they worked morning, noon, and night, 7 days a week. I came into the picture a few years later, and I, at their bequest, started doing their books, their payroll. And in 1979, they built a new facility on the northwest side of Milwaukee called Midwest Iron and Metal, a very large recycling facility. And I was very, very proud of everything they accomplished. The Business Journal was a new newspaper in the Wisconsin area in those years. And they wrote an article called The American Dream. And it was the story of two refugees, hardly educated, who came to this country and worked hard and made a life for themselves and their families. Now, if Walter was the one here standing before all of you today, especially the students, well, to the teachers too, but I'm not worried about your educators. He would say to you as students that one of the reasons, two reasons that I go and speak to schools. One, being able to tell my story helps me with my own mental health. I'm not here to spread hate. I'm here to have an understanding of what can happen if led the wrong way. It was human being to human being. And remember, not every German was a Nazi. Many German citizens went to their death because they would not sign up for the party. But many people in life look for a reason why things happen to them, and they're always blaming somebody else, not themselves. The other thing he would say to you is, you as students always was his hope for a better world. That all of you, through your ability to be educated and to please respect one another, because the bullying that goes on in this country, especially among students, young people, was the way the Nazi Party got started. Finding scapegoats, beating them up, verbally abusing them. His hope, he would have walked right up and down the rows of seats, your desks, or wherever he was in assembly. If it was an auditorium, he would have walked up and down the stairs and he said, you are my hope for a better world. And that's my hope for all of you. And please, please remember to respect one another. Thank you so much for having me. Are there any questions?
Sorry about that. I meant to just unmute somebody who had a question, but it didn't quite work like that. So can you hear me, Arleen?
That you just gave the kids a real world vision of what that time was like, and we very much appreciate you sharing your husband's story.
I very much appreciate all of you for being the educators that you are. And Renee, keep in touch. We've known each other a long time, and thank you for this invitation all.
Yeah, I was
Have a
booted
good
off.
afternoon.
I'm sorry if I unmuted everybody. I meant to only unmute somebody that had a question, and I accidentally did unmute all, and then I was removed from the meeting. So I guess
that sounds like something I would do. Okay, be well.
One of the kids had a question if you've ever written a book.
No, there was a book written by the State Historical Society, the Jewish Archives Division. And one section is totally about Walter. They took survivors that lived in the state of Wisconsin, both Jewish and Christian. They took a representative from each country. He was approached about writing a book years ago. For some reason, I never really understood. He would have donated the profit from the book elsewhere because he saw too many survivors. Some of the conventions we went to and others that were writing books, and some people their egos were getting a little too big at times, and that bothered him. He felt if you were going to tell your story, you did it, and whatever you earned, you should be helping others elsewhere. So that's the only reason that I know. I mean, he was approached by 2 different people, and his answer was no. So that's the only thing that's out there, other than the testimony with the Shoah Foundation, with the Spielberg Foundation, which is a long one. Oh my God, if you think 90 minutes was long, this one is really a long one. But his children and grandchildren will carry things on, hopefully. I know his children will. And as long as I have my health, I will continue.
That's wonderful that you do that for us. We are very fortunate to have his legacy living on. Wonderful. One of the students wants to know if he ever had post-traumatic stress disorder. And I know you addressed that a little bit. That's why he did talk. So was he ever diagnosed with it, or did he just do it for his own mental health?
When Walter, neither one of us knew a lot about PTSD. I mean, every once in a while we'd be around somebody who would say, oh, I have PTSD. Well, my husband had this attitude that if he survived and could go on with his life, everybody should be able to. But the years later, as his own health was failing, and I would say his last couple of years of life, he was living, he didn't have dementia or anything like that, but he was living more back in Europe than he was in the United States, walking down memory lane. And at one point he was very sick. He was in St. Luke's Medical Center for 54 days and in the CVICU unit. And would not speak English. He would only speak Polish. He thought he was back in the camps. He would not let a male nurse take care of him because it was a guard, he thought. He kept his hand tucked into his pillowcase because that's where he was hiding his gun. And I was lucky enough that a very, very dear friend of ours, Rose, she's my only survivor female friend that's still alive. And she's living in an assisted living facility in Milwaukee. I get to see her. I was able to bring her down to St. Luke's, and she would translate for the staff. And gradually, one of his friends, a survivor that lived with him after the war, flew in from Detroit and stayed with him day and night up in the CVICU unit. We finally got his hand out of the pillowcase because Abe said, don't worry, Walter, I have my own gun. I'll take care of you. And then I went to a bookstore and bought several books, pictorial books on America, because he loved this country. And I would sit at his bedside showing him the different parts of the United States where we used to travel. And thank God the doctors were wrong, and he did well, we took him out in a wheelchair, but he did walk out of the hospital. The odds were not there. Yes, he did have a form of PTSD. And of course, now that I do a lot of volunteer work with mental health, I will tell you that I really understand what it's all about. It was not identifiable to me in the 70s and 80s.
That is true, because we didn't hear about it that much.
No. I think my experience of doing volunteer work at the Veterans Administration at the hospital opened up my eyes to a lot of things. And now I have two very dear friends that head the PTSD teams out there. So I'm not that smart. I'm still learning. Anybody else?
You can either chat the comment to me, or I think you may be able, students, to turn off your mute. If not, I guess just chat it to me. I don't want to unmute all of you and then have the same thing happen as before, that somebody's dog is...
They can unmute themselves if they...
They should be able to, right? I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All they have to do is touch that little...
Microphone.
Yeah, microphone.
I did it.
You did.
All right, John.
Hi, John.
Hi.
Do you have a question?
No.
Okay. Well, then we'll just say
Showing us
hello
that
to
he
one
can,
another.
I think he was just showing us he can unmute. Thanks, John, for letting us know that.
Yeah.
Okay, anyone else with a question?
Hi, Mrs. Willersheim, this is Mrs. Garshinsky. And it's not so much of a question, but I was recalling a story from one of my past relatives. And, you know, when you think about the name that you're given, all of you on here, what a precious thing that is, because as Arleen was saying, that last name was always pronounced different, spelled different, those types of things. And I had a relative, I jotted a note, her name was Alice. However, that was not her given name. Her name was Elizabeth. But when she came over to the United States and came through Ellis Island, they couldn't understand what she was saying because she was speaking with such a German accent and trying to say her version of Elizabeth. They just couldn't get it, so they named her Alice. And that was her name on her death certificate, on every single certificate. Her name was never allowed to be changed back to her given name. That somebody was allowing, you know what I mean, that someone just allowed, was able to change her name. And it's kind of sad.
It's a very, thank you for sharing that. It's a very expensive court procedure to change a name. It isn't just that you go and say, I'm filling out this paper. And the reason that names were so important to survivors, I think you as educators probably know this, that once they were in the camps, they were no longer had a name. They were only called by number. And in Walter's case, the number that was tattooed on his body was 129514. And that's what he was known as for 2 years in Auschwitz. The other camps that didn't tattoo, it was on your dog tag that you hung around your neck. But you never had a name. You only had a number. Thank you for sharing that. All right, I'm going to have to get ready for a meeting. So not another speaking engagement. Thank you all. You all mean so much to me. And
Everybody,
thanks you also.
If everybody that's here could unmute themselves and give her some appreciation, a round of applause or a thank you, whatever it is you can do for us, that'd be
Make
great.
me cry.
So very much.
And thank you all.
Thank you.
Being a subject
Appreciate
that's
you.
very important. Bye-bye.
Be safe, Arlene. Thank you much.